On the surface, The Giant is a pretty straightforward remake of Riese. It's not a full reimagining or recontextualization like Tog der Toten or Blood of the Dead or the other Aether maps on Black Ops 4. On The Giant, you spawn in the same place, and none of the areas are new or taken away from the old one. But even within that framework, there were still some subtle changes made that were really revealing as to how the design for the mode had shifted from those early World at War days to the Blundell era of Black Ops 3. The most obvious changes are the ones that just come automatically as part of being a Black Ops 3 map, the gobblegums, faster movement, more aggressive zombies, and double pack-a-punch, and other things like that. All of those things do change the experience of playing the map, and they do highlight some key changes to how the philosophy of designing the mode had changed behind the scenes. But, for one, I've already talked about what the thinking was that went into those decisions and what the ramifications were in another video. And what's more interesting to me now is taking those more general things out of the equation and just looking at a direct comparison of how the developers approached designing the exact same map 7 years later.
Dr. Maxis.
Literally the second you select the map, you hit what I think is one of the biggest signs of the times when it comes to comparing early zombies to Black Ops 3, because before you even load into the space, a cutscene plays. It just really exemplified how the story was now a central pillar of the mode. That's not to say that the storytelling had gotten to the point of being conventional. A lot of the pieces of the puzzle were still in those hidden radios and ciphers, and the most complex and hard to follow parts of the story with the dimensional fractures and time travel came from this game and the next one. But even though that narrative was dense, it was still meant to be a core, integral part of the experience for all players. Almost every map had fully acted and animated intro and outro cutscenes, and even though individual Easter egg steps were just as obscure and cryptic as ever, there was enough context for players to understand at least what the characters' overall goals were. It's not like the original Riese didn't have any narrative elements. Realistically, it's where pretty much everything we know as the Aether story actually started. Layered throughout the map was the context of this being the place where Doctors Maxis and Richtofen were experimenting with Element 115 and created the zombies to begin with. The difference was in how it was presented. Back then, it was completely tertiary to everything else. The gameplay was the only priority at the time. Most players would never even know the radios existed to begin with, and the developers were totally fine with that. They were passionate about it. It wasn't that they didn't care, but they were happy to hide it away so that the only people who would even know there was a story were the players who were just as passionate. The ones who were digging deep and actively trying to discover all the little secrets. And that ties into what I think is the next big difference that really divides the two eras. In the early days, those cryptic story hints were the Easter eggs. Everything that was gameplay relevant was out in the open, and the progression was pretty rigid. All the weaponry was out of the box or on the walls, and the only way to get perks was by buying them. Because the developers didn't want to break that progression, the hidden secrets that we all got excited about back then were either 1, literally nothing, just a puzzle to solve for the sake of solving it, or 2, it was one of those ephemeral bits of lore, just a new mystery to think about. Things like the story of Group 935 here, or the mysterious 5th painting on Kino, or the backstory of the Verrucht Marines you could find on the Black Ops terminal. Compare how the two different maps treat the Fly Trap, which was basically the main Easter egg. On Riese, it was a pretty straight-up scavenger hunt, with a couple Samantha voice lines just letting you know when you were making progress or when you were done. It just kind of existed. There was no real context for why the player should be doing it. On The Giant, they brought that same quest back, and it was pretty much identical in execution, with you having to get a pack-a-punched weapon to trigger it, and then find the 3 items. The only difference was that those items were in slightly different spots. But the entire context around it was different. For one, getting back into narrative, the stakes were a lot higher, and it really highlighted how the storytelling and the entire genre of the mode had changed. It had taken that really sharp turn from the World at War era of World War II conspiracy theories to the more advanced science fiction and even fantasy elements. If you had to attach any narrative to that original Riese iteration, it was a very 50s sci-fi or classic Twilight Zone premise. You have a child getting caught up in a science experiment gone wrong, and then the players get dragged into playing hide-and-seek with them. In Black Ops 3, that same quest was instead allowing Dr. Maxis to calibrate his Agarthan beacon and track which point in time and what dimension the Primus crew had traveled to. Then, on the gameplay side, they weren't relying on there just being something different to do being enough of an incentive anymore. The idea behind most Easter eggs in this era was to reward players more tangibly for putting in that work. So, here, after finding all of the items, you'd be able to collect the specialist weapon for the map, the Annihilator. I don't think that change in methodology is an objective up or downgrade. I think there are definitely pros and cons to both approaches. It's definitely more relevant to the wider player base to get things that actually impact the gameplay, so this probably got more people diving into maps and learning more about them. But having that kind of tangible and quantifiable effect means that they can get normalized as just part of the strategy. They become just a utilitarian tool that has that mystique taken away. There was something magical about those early days where you could stumble across something and feel like you had discovered something truly secret. And they also added one more practical reason to do it, with it being part of the Black Ops 3 Super Easter egg. It is a pretty minor thing, but it gives the map a sense of persistence outside of a single session. The things you do within a game carry outside of it, tracking the gate worm after you complete the flytrap for the first time, and by association being part of giving you the RK5 on spawn every time after you complete the endgame. That kind of permanence was completely foreign to World at War zombies. You wouldn't see anything like that back then. It was completely strict in being a roguelike experience where every single game you always started from absolute zero and nothing carried over between sessions. On the topic of Easter eggs, for the upgrade to Black Ops 3, they also added even more small side objectives for players to do. The Origins and Onward philosophy was to pack in as many of those little side quests with tangible rewards as physically possible. Even though the map was still that same pretty small space, just the flytrap wasn't enough to satisfy that philosophy, so they also added the unlockable 6th perk. By default on the Giant, you had the original 4 World at War perks, plus the Mule Kick that was added for the Black Ops re-release. But then, by throwing monkey bombs in all 3 teleporters, you could unlock one extra hidden machine that was either Stamina Up or Deadshot Daiquiri. It switched randomly every game. Those perk machines feed into what I think is the last and biggest difference that really defines the Giant as a separate entity than Riese, and makes it flow really differently even while using the same physical space. On Riese, the perks were in fixed locations. Juggernog was always in the dead-end hallway, and Quick Revive was always at Teleporter C. On the Giant, all 5 of those default perks were shuffled completely randomly every new game, and there was no way to tell what was where until you made it to that spawn point. It sounds like another really minor change, but this is the one that really makes the biggest impact on the moment-to-moment experience of playing the map. In the past, random perks were used a lot less often than you'd think. Usually, they were actually placed really intentionally, with valuable perks being placed in dangerous areas or deep into the map where you couldn't get them until you'd worked your way up to it. Or they'd use those placements to craft a very well-defined experience for players, like the narrative told by the approach to Juggernog on Call of the Dead I talked about in the Black Ops 3 video. When perks were random, that was also a very intentional decision in and of itself. They only took that route when it supported a specific design goal they had for the map. The random branches on Shadows of Evil and Shinonuma are used to introduce some more well-defined roguelike elements into the maps to give the pretty formulaic setup phase some variety. Or Nuketown was designed to be a hard map that challenged players' survival skills. So, to achieve that goal, it took things like point building and guesswork out of the equation as much as possible by gating perks behind time instead to make sure it was testing the right things. The Giant explicitly wasn't built with that in mind, just by definition because it was Riese and Riese wasn't. That same level of intentionality wasn't there. You couldn't pinpoint what exactly it was adding to the map. It felt like the developers just thought, why not? It's random for the sake of it. When you turn power on, you're guaranteed to have access to 3 of the 5 perks, and 4 if you go through the right path from spawn, which makes it now just objectively the better option. The game just doesn't change all that much no matter what spawns where. You just have to put in a little bit of brain power to mentally remap the space every time, and every couple games you'll have to open 1 extra door before you can get Juggernog. And, kind of as a footnote to that, the mystery box's starting location was also random, instead of always being by the power switch. It was part of that same move to that low investment way to add some game-to-game variety, and I'm not sure it's as egregious as the perks here, but I'm also not sure how much it adds either. That mule kick spawn being added to the garage combined with the new randomness of the perks made that right path statistically the better way to go every single time, because it increased your odds of having Juggernog be one of those machines and be available to you as soon as you turn on power. But if you see the light for the box on the left, you could have an interesting decision being put in front of you. Go right and trust in those logical odds and play it safe, or go left and gamble on getting something good out of the box to start off strong instead. That's probably the most compelling case, but again, because it's random, that isn't always going to be the choice that's put in front of you. If the box ends up spawning in the garage too, then that actively removes that interesting decision. The randomness has now kind of cheapened the experience. I just don't think the randomness adds anything to the map. It doesn't harm it in any real way, but it would be more consistent if it was intentionally crafted to do something specific instead. That philosophy of randomizing as many things as possible and kind of letting the game come up with its own interactions is a core pillar of roguelike games. Zombies obviously does borrow a lot from that genre, but that's not all it is. It's got other things going on with the wave-based survival and the first-person shooter framework of it all. The environments are very carefully crafted as opposed to procedurally generated. And at a pure numbers level, there just aren't enough of those variable systems to have those emergent interactions you'll see in something like Spelunky. Because of all that, those design principles can't work in the same way anymore. So, I think the core takeaway here is that in Zombies, and in game design in general, randomness isn't just a blunt tool that can be thrown on top of something that's already finished. It really needs to be baked into the design right from the start, and it has to support a well-defined goal. And it's pretty clear that Treyarch did understand this, because with the next map, they went back to 100% fixed perk locations, and with the one after that, they did random again, but it was with the much more familiar method of balancing them out between 2 somewhat symmetrical branches. The Giant is in a really interesting space as a map, with it being ostensibly a pretty clear-cut remake, using all the same geometry and rooms and doors. But then, especially compared to the actual remakes that came out with Zombies Chronicles, you can look back and see that they did take some pretty big liberties even within those constraints. Ultimately, it all comes back to that same thing I've talked about in the last 3 straight videos, how the mode had gone through this reboot into a Zombies 2.0. They'd committed hard to the new story they wanted to tell, the Easter eggs had evolved into a core part of the experience, and a bunch of other little things had all been polished up during that inflection point around Origins. And this map is probably the best example of that by showing that dichotomy with a clear black and white comparison. Both visions for the mode have their fans, and I personally don't think that one is necessarily better than the other, but they were very different, and this was really the last chance for people to decide if they were in or out. Making all those changes to one of the most iconic Zombies 1.0 maps to bring it into this new era was really a statement that they were only going to commit harder and harder to this new vision from here on out.